and welcome back to another episode of The Pilot Principle. This is the podcast where we take a look at just the first episode of a series, the pilot, and use it to decide if we should watch the entire series or at least the second episode. Why? Because there is just so little time and so much to bloody watch. We have another television adaptation or reimagining of a film this week as we are taking a look at the pilot episode of Netflix's One Day. If you're new here, the general structure of the pilot principle is that we take a look at the story, characters, the protagonists and the antagonists, the pace, the serial arc, or my speculations of the serial arc, as well as the end of episode hook, and then combining all of these elements, I let you know if I think the pilot episode has done its job and why. Now we have dotted some T's and crossed some I's. No, strike that, reverse it. Let's get into the pilot synopsis for One Day as provided by Netflix. In 1988, on the eve of their graduation, Emma and Dexter meet for the first time. It's an evening of almost romance and a morning of missed opportunity. I think that was quite a good synopsis, I'd say. I mean, it's tantalizing. We're thinking, why the almost and how was said opportunity missed? And also from this, we get that Emma and Dexter are meeting for the first time. So this is a night or a day of firsts. Okay, let's get into the credits. I love the credits. Can you already hear that? I've gotten excited. So to begin with, there is no pilot title for the pilot episode of One Day, as it will henceforth be known. But it does have an episode length of 38 minutes and a series length of 14 episodes. Weird flex. The pilot episode was written by Nicole Taylor, who is also credited as the series writer and series creator. Taylor has written episodes of Secret Diary of a Call Girl, Ashes to Ashes, Scott and Bailey, Dracula, Indian Summer, Three Girls, and The Nest, as well as writing the feature film Wild Rose. And she's actually won a BAFTA for Three Girls and Wild Rose. The pilot episode was directed by Molly Manners, who has directed episodes of Urban Myths, In My Skin, and Lazy Susan. I cannot comment on any of these series because I haven't seen them. Chugging straight on to our cast, we first have Ambika Mod, who plays Emma, and Mod has starred in episodes of The Bait, This Is Going to Hurt, and I Hate Susie. I did start watching the second series of I Hate Susie, but I just couldn't get into it. Even though a lot of people told me it was better than the first series, maybe I'll see what happens if a third series is announced. And last but not least on our teeny tiny cast list is Leo Woodall, who plays Dexter. And Woodall has starred in episodes of Holby City, Vampire Academy, gone too soon, The White Lotus Series 2, and Citadel. I never got round to watching Citadel. That was the really hyped Prime Video series starring Priyanka Chopra. Love me a bit of Priyanka Chopra. And the guy from Game of Thrones, whose name I do not remember. As mentioned, One Day is available to watch on Netflix. And if you didn't know, the series is actually based on the 2009 novel of the same name, written by David Nichols, which I have not read. And there was also a 2011 film starring Anne Hathaway as Emma and Jim Sturgess as Dexter, which I haven't watched. And that being said, considering I haven't read the book and I haven't watched the film, it will come as no surprise to you that I actually didn't intend to watch the series, but I literally had no other option. There was nothing on this week. So I did what I had to do. Sacrifices were made. And it's weird because I don't know why the story has never appealed to me. It does kind of sound like something that I would be into, but I don't know, I've never had any inclination to read the book or watch the film. However, I am not going to let that bias me. So with an open mind, let's see if the pilot episode can completely change my entire preconceived notion of the story of One Day. No pressure. And the first step on that journey is to talk about the first 10 minutes of the pilot episode. Why the first 10 minutes, you wonder? Because one of the functions of the first 10 minutes of a feature film script or a pilot script is to give us a rounded introduction to Act 1 and therefore the story, leaving us wanting more. So the first 10 minutes of the pilot episode of One Day goes like this. We are in Edinburgh on the 15th of July 1988, and we are right there in the centre of the joy and jubilation, dancing the night away with recent graduates. While making room for a breakdancer, because there's always one person who cannot help themselves but to break out on the dance floor, Emma bumps into Dexter. They share a lingering look and polite British apology and acceptance of apology and go back to their respective friends. However, a little later, Dexter tracks down Emma at the party and this time doesn't let her go. They dance, they drink, and they talk, and they end up going back to her flat, lips and hands all over each other. In her room, they're leading up to the main event when Emma suddenly asks, "What's your plan for life?" The question takes the spark out of things as Emma and Dexter discuss or avoid discussing what comes next for each of them. I will say that this discussion begins around the 9-minute mark and ends about 5 minutes later, which roughly takes us to the 13-minute mark. In terms of my thoughts on those first 10 minutes, I think it's an interesting dynamic that we've been introduced to. We've got one character who wants to have sex and the other character who wants to talk but also doesn't not want to have sex too. And so we are kind of caught in a will they, won't they, even though they kind of almost will, but will they actually? And admittedly, it's a bit of a frustrating intro too, as an audience member. We kind of feel like we've been built up to a moment that doesn't happen. And you know what? It's kind of clever because that frustration in a way keeps us, the audience, interested. Because if what we expected to happen didn't happen, then what the hell is going to happen next? Moving on to our main characters, of which we have two. Firstly, let's start with Emma. And Emma is Northern. Apparently that's a whole personality type in itself. And she is presumably from a working class background. In answering her own question of what she wants from life, we understand that she wants to make a difference and she is excited by the prospect of the future. She's the kind of person whose big mouth I think will get her in trouble, as there's a scene in the pilot where she thinks she's making a joke, but actually she's causing offense to Dexter. What's interesting about Emma is that as worldly as she thinks she is, she actually doesn't know much. She judges Dexter quite harshly and her views are based on one-dimensional stereotypes rather than any real experience. However, there's nothing wrong with an idealist, and so we automatically get that keen, wanting, fizzing nature of her personality. And that she's quite a thoughtful person in the sense that she, of course, asks the question, where do you see yourself in the future? Dexter, on the other hand, is almost the complete opposite. Where Emma sort of wears her heart and her want on her sleeve, Dexter is actually quite closed off. We know that he's posh, and we get this from his accent and the people in his circle at the graduation party, as well as his parents. He also does kind of live in a sheltered bubble with no real plans for his future outside of travel. And oddly enough, his quote-unquote maturity, at least that's how Emma sees it, paints an equal picture of life at 21 as her idealistic nature does. But in the vein of Dexter being relatively internalized, at least compared with Emma, we do begin to wonder, what does he stand for? Looking at Emma and Dexter as a pair, they are clearly children. They are idealistic and uncertain. They're taking it one step at a time and they're doing the best that they can. They're kind of like those cute baby giraffes, all long-limbed and graceless. And right now they're both wrapped in bubble wrap and we want to keep them that way. As a couple, they're not hard to envision. You've got Emma as the driving force and Dexter who takes a bit more of a back seat and perhaps convincing Emma to take a moment to stop and smell the roses. As I'm sure you guessed, there are no antagonists in the pilot episode, but if I had to say something, and I always feel like I have to say something, I would say that time is the antagonist here. And I'm not just saying that because I want to flex my knowledge and my understanding and be a bit artsy. I really do think that time, in a sense, is an antagonist, and we do see that play out a little bit in the pilot episode of there not being enough time or things happening at the wrong time and their time being interrupted and their time together coming short and their time starting. And time is also unpredictable, so it'll be interesting to see how time plays with Emma and Dexter's lives in the future. But as for the pilot episode, things may not have gone as planned, but time was definitely on their side. Now it's time for a very quick interlude to see what TV and film life is looking like beyond the pilot principle. And first to talk about books, and yay me, I finally finished Morning Star by Pierce Brown, which is the third book in the Red Rising trilogy. Well, technically there are 2 more books, but I'm kind of seeing Morning Star as the end to that first story. I would say if you're looking for a sci-fi, kind of high fantasy, but more so on the sci-fi side, series to read or start, I would highly recommend the Red Rising trilogy. It's really, really good. It takes you to places that you didn't see coming. I walked in completely blind when I first read Red Rising, and if you just see where that Darrow started and where he ended, you could have never predicted it. And so it was really engaging, had a good amount of twists and turns, and I'm sad it's over. Well, it's not over. There is a further 2 chunky books in continuation of the series, but I don't know when I'm going to get there. So having finished Morning Star, the next audiobook I picked up was Us Against Them by Frederick Backman. And I don't read poetry. I don't listen to poetry, but I listen to Frederick Backman, and he wrote A Man Called Ove, if anybody's heard of that, or Anxious People, and Us Against Them is the second book in the Beartown series, and Beartown was my favorite read from last year. I would highly recommend it. I can't even really describe it. It just takes a look at a town who is obsessed with ice hockey and how a town becomes divided when something happens that involves the star player of the ice hockey team. That's all I'll say on that. Definitely go and read it. I basically just sit around with tears on the brim of my eyes the entire time as I'm listening to this book. It's just so beautiful. And in terms of physical books, I am still reading Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. What part have I just got up to? Oh, she's gone to visit Charlotte and Mr. Collins, and she's about to meet Catherine de Bourgh for the first time. If you have never read Pride and Prejudice, then sorry for the spoilers. But if you have, then you know what part I'm on. In terms of television, I finished The Brother's Son on Netflix, and man, I just really love those Son brothers, you know? Charles and, oh gosh, what's the younger brother's name? Bruce, Charles and Bruce, and their mum. It was really good. I think a really interesting look at what it's like to be the eldest child, especially in a heavily cultural family, and what that dynamic looks like, and the expectations and the pressures, as well as what it's like to be the youngest child and be ignored or sidelined. And it's also about like women's wants and women's needs and women's capabilities. It was great. It was fantastic. Definitely would recommend. Did take me a little bit of time to get into, but I think I just had a lot of things to watch and going on that I just didn't commit to it the way that I needed to. And speaking of playing catch up, I have caught up with True Detective Night Country. I believe at this point 4 episodes have shown out of 6. And I have to say, the imagery and the characters are compelling. Utterly compelling. I'm really enjoying Jodie Foster's character and her dynamic with Callie Reese's character, which I did predict for myself when I watched the pilot episode. And I have done a pilot principle episode on True Detective Night Country if you want to go and listen to that. But what's odd is that, yes, there is a murder mystery element to the storyline. And I love a murder mystery. I love a whodunit. I want to be out here playing detective. But I don't really care who murdered the scientists and Annie Kay. It's really interesting. I'm more invested in these characters and their lives, which I really didn't see coming from the pilot episode. And last but not least, in regards to film, I watched American Fiction, directed by Cord Jefferson this week, and I bloody loved it. The core themes and ideologies and the main character Monk's crusade against the publishing industry is grounding and it is hilarious. I would 10 out of 10 recommend. Before we head back to your regularly scheduled listening, don't forget to follow at Pilot Principle on Instagram, Threads, and Twitter/X, where we can chat about the latest in film and TV and books. In terms of what I really liked about the pilot episode of One Day, for me, the mood and the tone was done really, really effectively. You were very quickly and securely rooted in the time 1988 and the mental place that the characters were in. It made me nostalgic and it made me reminiscent, and I bought into the experiences of Emma and Dexter, and also, not gonna lie, envied them. I envied them. I thought, why the hell did I go and study in Sheffield when I could have been having a blast in Edinburgh? That's what I thought when I watched it as I was watching them. I don't know if that's what your takeaway is going to be, but that was definitely mine. But yes, the mood, the tone, the reminiscence, the nostalgia worked perfectly for me in this pilot episode. On the flippity flip side, in terms of what I didn't like, the pace. It kind of felt a bit too listless for me. Like, what was the goal? What was the driving point? Initially, it was sex, but then sex wasn't. So other than sex, especially because there was no sex, sure, the not having sex thing will likely come into the series, but it left the pilot episode feeling a bit unsure of itself. It didn't know where it was going. I didn't know where it was going, so I couldn't take it to where it was going. So yeah, that was a bit disappointing for me. Before we get into whether or not I will be continuing with the series, let's remind ourselves of the pilot synopsis. In 1988, on the eve of their graduation, Emma and Dexter meet for the first time. It's an evening of almost romance and a morning of missed opportunity. Firstly, with the quality of writing, I want to say that considering there was so much talk and dialogue between the two characters, meh. Yes, the characters said what they had to say and it was said well, capturing the spirit of two people in their early 20s. But it just wasn't as enrapturing as like Jesse and Celine in Linklaters Before Sunrise. And yes, arguably, as I'm thinking about it, I do think that's kind of what it was going for. Whether or not it was accidental, I don't know, but that's automatically where my mind went, especially when you look at a young couple spending 24 hours or less together, especially when they're just chatting. I automatically go to the Before trilogy, and so it just wasn't that. And I think that could also be because when they were having serious-ish discussions, they didn't really last long. Everything felt a bit surface level. In regards to the setting, Edinburgh was portrayed really well in everything from the streets to the views, but it wasn't too on the nose either, which I appreciated. I've talked a bit about this already, but regarding the pace, it was slow and not in a good way for me. Ultimately, three things happen. They're at a party, they're at Emma's flat, walking the streets of Edinburgh. None of that was punctuated by a major turning point other than time, which was fine. It's not an action comedy, but there were times I did feel a bit bored, and that's not what you really want to hear, especially in a program, a pilot, that's only 40 minutes long. Regarding the serial arc, not just because of the title, but with the timestamp at the beginning of the episode and the one that appears at the end, I understand that one day will be a where are they now of Emma and Dexter, likely every year until they are 40, because Emma asks on their first night, where do you see yourself by 40? Or she says something like, I can imagine you right now at 40. So I think the story continuing until they're in their 40s, or at least reach the point of being 40, I've said 40 so many times, is likely. And in terms of the end of episode hook, we fast forward to the 15th of July 1989, and Dexter is abroad with a woman in bed, and Emma is in the back of a car driving down a motorway. And that's our little teaser into episode 2. But has that teaser tickled us enough? Because it is now time to ask the only question that matters here on the pilot principle. Will I be continuing with One Day? Pause for dramatic effect. Yes, I will. And if it sounds like I'm trying to convince myself, that's because I am. Arguably, I'm not fully sold after watching the pilot episode, but I'm willing to give episode 2 at least a shot. And here are the reasons why. I mean, the characters did, by the end of the episode, Emma and Dexter, they did grow on me, and perhaps it was their youthfulness and their hopefulness and the abyss of what comes next, but I am interested in seeing at least the next stage of their journey. I know I gave the fast forwarding to the 15th of July 1989 as the end of episode hook, but before that there is another end of episode hook whereby Dexter gives Emma his number, or vice versa, and invites her to come and stay with him in London for a weekend. And so, yes, there's that teaser for me of, did Emma ever go and stay with Dexter for a weekend that summer? And if she does or doesn't, how will that possibly affect where they are now in episode 2, which will be July 15th, 1989. And the third reason why I am continuing for at least a second episode of One Day is because the episodes are short. The pilot episode was 38 minutes, and that's the longest episode throughout the 14 episode run. Episode 2 is only 26 minutes. I can spare 26 minutes. I mean, minus the credits, it's probably about 24. So I'm willing to give it 24 minutes to change my mind. But that is, of course, just me. And the things that haven't quite convinced me, and maybe an outright no for you, include the fact that there was no solid story so far. Two people meet and they have one night together. Okay, so what? It's also a bit short filmy. The night is over and so is their adventure. It's not the most memorable pilot that will have you immediately watching episode 2. I could leave them as they are there at the end of that pilot episode and not desperately think about finding out what happens next. Which leads me on to the pilot score for the pilot episode of One Day, and I'm going to go for it. I know I promised not to so much this year, but I'm going for a 2.5 out of 5. There were some good character introductions, and to be honest, that's the main thing that the pilot episode has going for it. I think the punctuation of time would have given a little more energy to the pilot episode. Also, yes, we can appreciate that what we get in the pilot episode is just a taste. It is the tip of the iceberg on a decades-long saga. However, I do think the pilot episode is lacking because it's relying too much on the knowledge of the wider arc, and maybe even the book and the movie, to convince people to watch beyond the pilot. And for that, episode 1 doth suffer. Now that we've hashed out the fundamental principles, will you be giving the pilot episode a watch? Or have you already binged every episode of one day? Follow and chat to me over on Threads, Instagram and Twitter /X @PilotPrinciple. Give the Pilot Principle a watch on your audio streamer of choice, and I will catch you on the next episode. Aww.